In this video, we're going to start the KutaSoftware Infinite PreAlgebra free worksheet, multiplying, dividing fractions, and mixed numbers. In this first part, we're going to be finding each product. And on the second page, we'll be finding each quotient. But for now, let's jump into number 1. Now, when multiplying a fraction, we multiply the numerators together and put that over the denominators multiplied together. And we still carry the same rules for multiplying integers. For example, in number 1, we have a negative number times a positive number. A negative times a positive, that's going to be a negative. So we know our solution is going to be negative, we just have to figure out that fraction. So again, we're going to multiply our numerators over multiplying our denominators. So 5 times 1, knowing that our answer is negative, that's going to be 5 in the numerator, and 4 times 3, that's going to be 12. So we have a negative 5/12 for our solution in number 1. And again, what we do is we just take 5 times 1 and we put that over 4 times 3. 5/12, and our solution's negative, because a negative times positive is a negative. Let's move on to number 2. In number 2, so 8/7 times 7/10, positive times a positive, that's going to be a positive. So I'm going to do this one 2 separate ways. The first way, we're going to do it just like we did in number 1. We're going to do 8 times 7, multiplying our numerators. 8 times 7 is going to be 56, over 7 times 10, which is 70. Now, 56 over 70 isn't simplest form. We're going to have to simplify it down. Now we just have to find the greatest common factor of both 70 and 56. Both of those are divisible by 14. 14 times 5 gives me 70, so 70 divided by 14 equals 5, and 56 divided by 4 is our 14, so 14 goes into 56 4 times. So I have 4/5 as my solution in number 2. But if you ask me, I think it was kind of hard to figure out the greatest common factor between 56 and 70. 14, I don't see that right away, so it took a little bit of work in my head. And it may take some scratch paper work for some of you. But let's simplify our problem before we continue on, because think about this. 2, we have 8 times 7, that's our numerator, all over 7 times 10. And remember, multiplication's commutative, so it doesn't matter the order we multiply in. But look at this. If I have 7 in my numerator and I have a 7 in my denominator, essentially 7 divides both. 8 times 7 divided by 7 is 8. 7 times 10 divided by 7 is 10. So I can just cancel out my 7s with each other, because 7 over 7 gives me 1. So now I'm just left with 8/10, which 8/10 is a whole lot easier to simplify down. Both are divisible by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. 4/5, again, is my solution in number 2. So it was a lot easier to simplify before we continued on. Let's try this helpful tip in number 3. So if I was to write out my numerator, I'd say 4 times 7 over 9 times 4. But think about this. Both are divisible by 4. The numerator is 4 times 7. The denominator is 9 times 4. So if I divide each of those by 4 right away, the 4's will cancel out. 4 divided by 4 is 1. So I can get rid of those 4's since they're multiplied in both the numerator and denominator. So I'm left with 7/9. And 7/9 cannot be simplified down any further. So 7/9 is our solution in number 3. And again, what this allows me to do, 4 times 7 is 28. 9 times 4 is 36. Both 28 and 36 are divisible by 4. 28 divided by 4 gives us 7, and 36 divided by 4 gives us that 9. 7/9 is our solution in number 3. In number 4, But fortunately, we don't have a product where the numerator and denominator cancel out, so we'll just do out the math. We have a negative times a positive, so we know we're going to have a negative. 2 times 5 is 10. 3 times 4 is 12. So negative 10 twelfths. But that can be simplified down because both are divisible by 2. 10 divided by 2 equals 5, and 12 divided by 2 equals 6. And I'm dividing by the same number because that's the greatest common factor between 10 and 12. And think about, if I divide in my numerator, I need to divide by that same number in my denominator so I don't change the value of the overall fraction. Negative 5 sixths is the same as negative 10 twelfths. It's just a little simpler and easier to understand. So negative 5 sixths is our solution in number 4. And another way you could simplify down earlier, and again, I just like showing multiple different ways until one clicks or sticks. But for number 4, we could have recognized that both 2 and 4 are divisible by 2. So if we divided our 2 by 2, we would get 1 here. And if we divided our 4 by 2, we would get 2 here. So simplifying before I even multiply, 1 times 5 is 5. 3 times 2 is 6. Negative 5 sixths. And again, that's because these had a greatest common factor that divided both of them. Let's move on to number 5. In number 5, we switch things up a bit because we throw in a whole number. However, when we see a whole number, I want you to think of it as a fraction. Negative 2, we can write as, if I'm rewriting the entire thing, negative 2 over 1, because negative 2 divided by 1 is still a negative 2. Now I'll multiply this to 3/7 so that I can see my numerators and I can see my denominators. A negative times a positive, that will be a negative. 2 times 3 is 6, and 1 times 7 is 7. Negative 6/7 is my solution in number 5. Now on to number 6. I wish it was as simple as number 5, where we could just put each of these over 1, but we cannot do that because we have negative 2 and 2/3. This is like negative 2 plus a 2/3. And 4 and 1/10 is like 4 plus 1/10. So before we can even think about multiplying these, we have to simplify. So negative 2 plus 2/3, I'll rewrite this. Negative 2 plus 2/3. We have this number, and we're going to be multiplying it by 4 plus 1/10. My suggestion from here would be to make these into improper fractions. So in order to combine these two, we need a common denominator when adding. Because a negative times a positive results in a negative, we know our answer is going to be negative. And then that way I don't have to worry about it in my problem. So now, in order to find that common denominator, I need a denominator of 3. What divided by 3 gives me 2? 6. So 2 I'll write as 6/3, and you can also think of that as multiplying 2 over 1 by 3 over 3, not changing the value of the fraction because I'm multiplying by 1, but I get 6/3, and then we'll add that to 2/3. That will get multiplied by, now we have to find a common denominator, which is 10. What divided by 10 gives us 4? That's going to be 40. So 40/10 is how we would write 4 with a denominator of 10, or you can think of it as 4 over 1 times 10 over 10. Multiplying by 1, not changing that value, that's going to be 40 over 10. So 40/10, we're going to add that to 1/10 to get this number. So scrolling down my page just a little bit so we can see 6 plus 2 is going to be 8 over, remember when we add fractions, we keep the denominator the same, so 8/3. That will get multiplied by 40 plus 1, adding the numerator to 41, keeping the denominator the same, 41 over 10. Now I can just multiply. 8 times 41, or 41 times 8, when I write that out, that will be 1 times 8 is 8, 4 times 8 is 32. So I get 328 over 3 times 10, which is 30. Now, what I'm actually going to do, I don't want to work with this big of a number, and I see that both 10 and 8 are even numbers and divisible by 2. So what I'm going to do is divide these by 2 before I even get started. 8 divided by 2, because I'm dividing my numerator by 2, that's going to be 4. And dividing my denominator also by 2 so that I don't change the value, that's going to be 5. So now I'm going to work with 4 times 41. 41 times 4. 1 times 4 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. So 164 over 3 times 5, which is 15. Now, I'm not saying this is an easy number to work with, but it's easier than what we previously had. So because we started, again, with mixed numbers, we have to end with mixed numbers in this problem. And remember, our solution's negative. Now, to create that mixed number, we have to see how many times 15 goes into 164. So, 15 divides into 164 how many times? Well, 15 doesn't go into 1, so I'll go over how many times does 15 go into 16? Once. So if 15 goes into 16 once, I'll subtract 115. 16 minus 15 is 1, and then I'll bring down my 4, so I'll get 14. How many times does 15 go into 14? 0 times. So I'm out of room here because 10 times 50 is 150, and I'm left over with 14. So this is going to equal 10 and my remainder, 14, out of the number I was dividing by, 14 fifteenths. Because the 15 goes into 164 10 whole times with 14 remaining. So 10 and 14 fifteenths. But remember, what did we say? This answer was negative. So our solution is negative 10 and 14 fifteenths. Now on to number 7. Again, we have some mixed numbers. Our first step, we're going to turn those into improper fractions because negative 2 and 1/5 is like, rewriting that, negative 2 plus a negative 1/5. Because negative 2 and 1/5, I have a negative 2 and a negative 1/5. That negative goes with both. So I'll rewrite this again. Negative 2 plus a negative 1/5. And all this is going to get multiplied eventually after I add to a negative 1 plus a negative 3/4 because the negative goes with both. Now let's simplify. And in order to do that, I need to be able to add with a common denominator. So how do I get 2 with a denominator of 5? Well, what divided by 5 gives me 2? That's going to be 10. And this is a negative 10 over 5. And I'm going to add that to a negative 1/5. And this all gets multiplied by, what divided by 4 gives me 1? A negative 4. So if I do a negative 4 over 4, I get a negative 1. And I add that to a negative 3/4. Negative 10/5 plus negative 1/5 is a negative 11/5. And I'll be multiplying that to negative 4 plus negative 3 is a negative 7 over 4. Negative 7/4. A negative times a negative, I know we're going to have a positive. So this is going to be 77 over 20. But really, if you think about it, we could have known the answer was positive in the beginning because we have a negative number times a negative number that's going to equal a positive. So we really could have treated these as positives the entire time. But we need to understand that a negative times a negative is a positive. And because we started with mixed numbers, we're going to end with mixed numbers. So we need to see how many times does 20 go into 77. Now, I can do this in my head because we have 20, 40, 60, 80 would be over that. So 20 goes into 77 3 times with a remainder of, well, if 20 times 3 would be 60. In order to go from 60 to 77, we add 17. So this would be equal to a positive 3 and 17/20. But that might be a little difficult to do in your head, which is fine. I've been doing this math for a while. So let's go ahead and do it out real quick on the side. If we have 77 divided by 20, we'll take 20 and see how many times it goes into 77. 20 doesn't go into 7, but 20 goes into 77 3 times. 3 times 20 equals 60. And when I subtract 77 minus 60, I get 17. And 20 can't go into 17, so I know that I have 3 with a remainder of 17. So my R, or my remainder, is 17. So 3 is the whole number, and 17 out of 20, 17 being that remainder, when I tried to divide by 20. 3 and 17/20. Now on to number 8. Right away we can think negative times a positive. It's going to be a negative. But I'll keep my negative sign in just to show you that you can still carry it through your work. If we have negative 1 and 1/4, that's going to be a negative 1 plus a negative 1/4, because the negative is with both the whole number and the fraction part of that mixed number. And we're multiplying all that by 9. Now we can convert this negative 1 so that we can add those as long as we have a common denominator. What divided by 4 equals a negative 1? That's going to be a negative 4 divided by 4 equals a negative 1. And we'll add that to negative 1/4. Then that number will get multiplied by 9. Negative 4 plus negative 1 is going to be negative 5. That's all over our common denominator of 4, and we're multiplying by 9. But I'm going to write 9 as a fraction so that I'll be able to multiply. And it's a whole number by itself, so I'll write that as 9/1. Now I can just simply multiply my numerators and multiply my denominators. Negative times a positive, that's going to be negative. 5 times 9 is a 45 over 4 times 1, which is 4. Now I started again with a mixed number here, so I got to keep it as a mixed number. How many times does 4 go into 45? Well, I know that 4 times 11 would be 44, so 4 goes into negative 45, negative 11 times with a remainder of 1. So negative 11 with a remainder of 1, because 11 times 4 would be 44, but we still need one more to get to 45. So negative 11 and 1/4. That's my solution in number 8. And if you need to do it the long division way, really quickly, we take 45, divide that by 4. 4 goes into 4 once, so 4 minus 4 is 0. Bring down the 5. How many times does 4 go into 5? That's going to be once. Subtract that 4. We have a remainder of 1 because 4 cannot go into 1. So 11 with a remainder of 1. 11 with a remainder of 1. So negative 11 and 1/4 is our solution in number 8. In number 9, we have two mixed numbers. We're going to have to turn them both into improper fractions before we multiply. So negative times a negative, we know our answer is going to be positive. So I'll go ahead and write this out. Taking just my values without the negatives, because I know my result is positive, I'll do 1 and 5/7, so that's 1 plus 5/7, and that will get multiplied by 2 and 1/2. 1 plus 5/7, making that common denominator, it'll be 7 over 7 plus 5 over 7. And that gets multiplied by, again, making that common denominator, that'll be 4 over 2, because 4 divided by 2 equals 2, plus 1/2. So I technically still have 1 plus 5/7, because 7 over 7 equals 1, and 4 halves is 2, plus 1/2. So I haven't changed anything by manipulating these fractions at all. Now I'll simply add. 7 plus 5 is 12. That's 12 over 7. And then 4 plus 1 is 5. And that's all over 2. Now if I multiply this as is, I'll get 60 over 14, which is fine to do, but these are larger numbers to work with when I know I can simplify before I even do the math. 12 and 2 are both even numbers, meaning they're both divisible by 2. 12 divided by 2 is going to be 6, and if I divide the numerator by 2, I have to divide that denominator by 2. And when I say numerator and denominator, I'm thinking of the numerator as that 12 times 5, and my denominator as the 7 times 2. So dividing the numerator by 2, I get 6 times 5. Dividing that denominator by 2, I'll now get 7 times 1. 6 times 5, and I'll cross these out in a different color so that you can see I'm no longer using these values. 6 times 5 is 30 over 7 times 1 is 7. These numbers are a little easier to work with. Now we have to get it back as mixed numbers. And we have to ask ourselves, how many times does 7 go into 30? 7 goes into 30, well, 7 times 4 is 28. So that's going to be 4 times evenly. But if 7 times 4 is 28, how many more sevenths do we need to get to 30 sevenths? 2. 28 plus 2 gets us to 30, and that's 2 over 7. So 4 and 2 sevenths is our solution in number 9. And again, if you want to see this in a different light, let's look at 30 sevenths. 30 sevenths, I'm going to write as 28 over 7 plus 2 over 7, right? 28 plus 2 is still 30, and if I'm adding over a common denominator, my denominator is still 7. 28 divided by 7, that's going to be my 4. 2 over 7, 2 sevenths. That's just another way to look at this. Now, let's continue on to number 10, the last problem on the first page. Again, we're going to be finding that common denominator for each of these, but before we get started, negative times a positive, that's going to be a negative, and I'll leave my negative in my problem so that you can see how it gets carried through. Negative 2 and 3/8, remember that negatives with both the whole number and the fraction. So that'll be negative 2 plus a negative 3/8, and that all gets multiplied by 2 plus a 1/2. Finding my common denominator here, what divided by 8 gives me 2, or a negative 2? That's going to be 16. So negative 16 over 8 gives me a negative 2, and I'll be adding that to negative 3/8, which gets multiplied by what divided by 2 gives me 2? That's 4. 4 over 2 equals 2, and I'll be adding that to 1/2. Negative 16 plus negative 13 is going to be negative 19 over 8, and that will get multiplied by 4 over 2 plus 1 over 2. 4 plus 1 is 5 over our common denominator 2. Now, I don't see any common factor among my numerators or denominators as is, so I'll go ahead and multiply negative 19 times 5. So we have 19 times 5. 9 times 5 is 45. And if you want to know how I multiply by 9 so fast, check out my video for a cool math trick in the link below. Now, 9 times 5 is 45. Write my 5, carry my 4. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 4 is 9. So I'm going to have 95, but remember, negative times positive, this fraction is going to be negative. So negative 95 over 16. Now we started with mixed numbers, got to end with mixed numbers. And the real question is, how many times does 16 go into 95? 16 goes into 95 5 times, because 16 times 5 is 80. 16 times 6 would be 96, so we went over. So we have to go with that smaller value of 5. So we're going to have a negative. 5 times 16 is 80. So how much is left over from this 95? If we took 95 minus 80, we would get 15. So negative 5 and 15/16 is our solution in number 10, because 15 is our remainder. When we divide 95 over 16, 16 goes into it evenly 5 times with a remainder of 15, negative 5 and 15/16. Let's continue on to the second page. Now in the second page, we're going to be finding each quotient, and I'm going to make this super easy on ourselves. Ready? When we divide by a fraction, don't forget, it's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. Now, what exactly is the reciprocal? The reciprocal is that fraction flipped. So, as opposed to having negative 1/5 divided by 7/4, I'm going to write this as negative 1/5. And remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, so I'm going to flip it. Dividing by 7/4 is the same as multiplying by 4/7. So you see, my 4 went into my numerator, my 7 flipped to my denominator. And then this division turned into multiplication. So dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So negative 1/5 times 4/7, we know how to multiply fractions. That's easy. Negative times a positive is a negative. 1 times 4 is 4. 5 times 7 is 35. Negative 4/35 is our solution, and number 11. Biggest takeaway when dividing by fractions: dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. Multiplying by that fraction flipped. Let's continue on to number 12. In number 12, we have negative 1/2 divided by 5/4. Negative divided by positive, we know is going to be a negative. But as opposed to dividing by a fraction, we're going to multiply by its reciprocal. So we're going to have negative 1/2, and we're going to multiply that by 4/5. So again, I flipped my fraction, and now we're multiplying as opposed to dividing. And regardless, a negative times positive is also a negative. So we get a negative whether we divide or multiply. So multiplying the numerators, negative 1 times 4, that's going to be a negative 4 all over 2 times 5, which is 10. Now both the numerator and denominator are divisible by 2, so let's simplify that down. 4 divided by 2 will be 2, and 10 divided by 2 will be 5. So we get negative 2/5 as our solution in number 12. And again, simplifying down is as easy as finding the greatest common factor, the greatest number that both 4 and 10 have as a common factor. So 2 goes into 4 and 2 goes into 10. If you need to, write out the factors. For 10, we have 1 and 10, 2 and 5, and that's it. For 4, we have 1 and 4, and then 2 and 2. So you can see that the greatest common factor is going to be a 2. Let's move on to number 13. In number 13, we have negative 3/2 divided by negative 10/7. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So I'll do negative 3/2 multiplied by negative 7/10. Negative divided by a negative, or a negative times a negative, is going to be a positive. So my answer is positive. 3 times 7 is 21, and 2 times 10 is 20. So 21/20 is my solution in number 13. In number 14, we have 1/2 divided by 8/7. Again, I'll say this each time. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So multiplying by that flipped fraction. So we'll do 1/2 times 7/8, flipping the 7 and the 8. 1 times 7 is 7. 2 times 8 is 16. 7/16 is our solution in number 14, and it is indeed positive. A positive times a positive, or a positive divided by a positive, is positive. On to number 15. We have negative 9/5 divided by 2. Remember, dividing by a number is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. But what exactly is 2 in fraction form? 2 in fraction form is 2 over 1, 2 divided by 1. So as opposed to dividing by 2, I'll multiply by that reciprocal. So negative 9/5 will get multiplied by not 2 over 1, but flipping that fraction, 1 over 2. And think about that. Dividing a number by 2 is the same as taking half of it, or finding half of it. So we're multiplying by half. Negative times positive, that's going to be a negative. So 9 times 1 is 9, and 5 times 2 is 10. Negative 9/10 is our solution in number 15. Now in number 16, we start having mixed numbers. So in order to divide, I first need to turn both of my numbers, the mixed number and the whole number, into improper fractions. I want to deal with just fractions. So negative 3 and 5/9 is like having negative 3 plus a negative 5/9. And that's going to be divided by 3, which I'll turn that into a fraction as 3 over 1. So negative 3 and 5/9, finding that common denominator, it's 9. So what divided by 9 gives us 3? That's going to be 27. So we'll have a negative 27 over 9, because our 3 is negative, and we'll be adding that to negative 5 over 9. And again, we're dividing by 3, or 3 over 1. Negative 27 plus negative 5 is going to be a negative 32. So we have negative 32 over 9, and we're dividing that by 3 over 1. So now that I have everything as fraction, remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now have negative 32/9, but I'm going to be multiplying that by 1/3, because I'm flipping my 3 and 1. And a negative times a positive is a negative. 32 times 1 is 32, and that's all over 9 times 3, which is 27. Now, we started with a mixed number, so we're going to end with a mixed number. How many times does 27 fit into 32? Well, it only fits in once, so we'll have the negative whole number 1, and how much of that 32 is remaining? 5, right? Because 27 plus 5 gets us to 32. So we'll have 5 27ths still to get to negative 32 27ths. So our solution is negative 1 and 5 27ths. And again, in order to figure out the fraction part, I saw how many times 27 went into 32, and it only fit in once evenly. And then once I put 27 into 32 once, I had 5 remaining. So negative 1 and 5 27ths. In number 17, I have negative 2 divided by negative 3 and 4/5. So we got to start by finding that common denominator so that we can add our mixed number. So we'll have negative 2, and I'll write this in fraction form. Negative 2 over 1. And I'll be dividing that by negative 3 plus negative 4/5. So we have negative 2 over 1, and we'll be dividing that by finding that common denominator. What divided by 5 gives us 3, and that's going to be 15. So negative 15 over 5 gives us 3, and we'll be adding that to negative 4 over 5. Negative 15 plus negative 4 is a negative 19. So we'll have negative 2 over 1 divided by negative 19 over 5. And remember, the takeaway from dividing fractions, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So I'll have negative 2 over 1 times, flipping that negative 19 fifths, it'll be times negative 5 19ths. So negative 2 times negative 5, a negative times a negative, that's going to result in a positive. So 2 times 5, 10 over 1 times 19, 19. 10 19ths. And I started with a mixed number, and I don't have any whole numbers because 19 cannot go evenly into 10. So this is the simplest form, 10 19ths. Let's continue on to number 18. So for number 18, we have 1/9 divided by negative 1 1/3. So rewriting my fraction, 1/9, I'm going to divide that by negative 1 1/3 is negative 1 plus negative 1/3. So I got to create a common denominator in order to add these two numbers. So I'll rewrite my 1/9, dividing that by, the common denominator would be 3. And how do I get a negative 1? That'll be a negative 3 over 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and it's negative. So I'll be adding that to a negative 1/3. So I have 1/9 divided by negative 3 plus a negative 1 is going to be a negative 4/3. Now remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So I'll have 1/9, and I'll be multiplying that by a negative 3/4. Originally I had 4/3. Flipping it, I'll get 3/4, and it's negative. A positive fraction times negative is going to be negative. 1 times 3 is going to be 3 over 9 times 4, which is 36. But I know I can simplify this. Both 36 and 3 are divisible by 3. So that would give me, dividing 3 by 3 would be 1, and dividing 36 by 3 would give me 12. So negative 3/36 is equal to negative 1/12. So negative 1/12 is my solution in number 18. And also note that I could have recognized that both 9 and 3 are divisible by 3 at the start, because 1 times 3 is going to be divisible by 3, and if 9 is divisible by 3, 9 times 4 is going to be divisible by 3. So 3 divided by 3 would be 1, and 9 divided by 3 would be 3. 1 times 1 gives me that 1, 3 times 4 gives me 12, and it's negative. Let's move on to number 19. Number 19, we have two mixed numbers, so let's get ready to find some common denominators. 1 6/7 will be 1 plus 6/7, and that will be divided by 5 3/4 is 5 plus 3/4. 1 6/7, finding that common denominator will be 7, and 1 will simply be 7 over 7. So I'll be adding 7 over 7 to 6 over 7. 7 plus 6, that's going to be 13 over 7. Now let's figure out that second half of my expression. 5 plus 3/4, that common denominator is 4. So if I had a number divided by 4, what would give me 5? Well, that's going to be 20 divided by 4. 20 over 4 is equal to 5. So I'll be adding that to 3/4. 20 plus 3 is 23 over our common denominator of 4. Now, here we go. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So I'm going to take 13/7. I'll write that a little neater. And I'll be multiplying it by 4 over 23 as opposed to dividing by 23 over 4. So now my numerator and my denominator do not have any common factors, so I'll just simply multiply. 4 times 13, if you want to see that vertically, 4 times 3 is 12. Carry the 1. 1 times 4 is 4. Plus 1 is 5. So my numerator is going to be 52, and that's going to be all over 7 times 23. Let's go ahead and do it vertically. 3 times 7 is 21. Carry the 2. 2 times 7 is 14. Plus 2 is 16. So 52 over 161, and my answer is indeed positive. 52 over 161 is my solution in number 19. Lastly on this worksheet, let's do number 20. But before we jump into it, if you've been finding this video helpful, give me a thumbs up. Also, while you're at that, subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. But anyway, for now, let's continue on. So we have negative 3 7/10 divided by a positive 2 1/4. So we know our answer in the end is going to be negative. But let's do out the math. Negative 3 7/10 is like negative 3 plus a negative 7/10. And we're going to be dividing that by a positive 2 1/4. 2 plus 1/4. The common denominator over here is going to be 10. What divided by 10 gives us a negative 3? That's going to be a negative 30 divided by 10 gives us a negative 3, and we'll be adding that to negative 7/10. And that's all divided by 2 plus 1/4. The common denominator here is going to be 4. So what divided by 4 gives us 2? That's going to be 8 divided by 4. 8 divided by 4 is equal to 2. So I'll be adding that to 1/4. Now, simple addition of adding fractions. Negative 30 plus negative 7 is going to be negative 37, and that's all over our common denominator of 10. And I'll be dividing that by 8 plus 1 is 9 over 4. Now remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So we'll have negative 37 over 10, and I'll be multiplying that by 4 over 9. Dividing by 9/4 is the same as multiplying by 4/9. Now before I continue on, I can do a little bit of simplification here, because both 4 and 10 are divisible by 2. So I'll do 4 divided by 2, which gives me 2. So dividing my numerator by 2, and I'll divide my denominator by 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And again, that was because 37 times 4 is divisible by 2, because 4 is divisible by 2. And 10 times 9 is divisible by 2, because 10 is divisible by 2, to give us 5. So we have 37 times 2, which is a little bit easier to do than 37 times 4, and then we have 5 times 9. So negative times positive, we know we're going to have a negative. 37 times 2, that's going to be 74. And if you want to double check, 37 times 2, 7 times 2 is 14. Carry the 1, 3 times 2 is 6, plus 1 is 7. All over, so negative 74 over 45. 5 times 9 is 45. And if you want to know how I multiplied 5 and 9 so easily, check out my video where I show you a cool finger trick for multiplying by 9. So we're almost done, except remember, we started with mixed numbers, we got to end with mixed numbers, and this is definitely an improper fraction. So we can get a whole number or two out of it. Let's see. 45 goes evenly into 74 only one time. So we'll have a negative whole number 1. And I know it's only one time because if I tried to double 45, I'd get to 90, and 90 is bigger than 74. So now I just have to figure out my remainder. What is 74 minus 45? Because that'll be my remainder if I already take 45 out of that 74. I can't do 4 minus 5, so I'll borrow from my tens place. 14 minus 5 is 9. 6 minus 4 is 2. So 29 will be my remainder. So negative 1 and 29 45ths. Negative 1 and 29 45ths is the last solution on this worksheet. If you have any questions, like I said before, leave them in the comments below. If you want more ways to support me, check out my Patreon page. Click my Patreon link in the description below and become a patron. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.